Baruch atah Yahuwah Eloheinu melech haolam. Okay,
Amen.
so specifically, if we talk about this pattern in the Mishkan, where that phrase comes from is in Exodus, Shemot, chapter 25, verse 9. If you back up to verse 8, it says, "They shall make a sanctuary for me."
What chapter? Sorry.
Exodus 25. And that's actually a mikdash. "They shall make a sanctuary for me so that I may dwell among them." That's verse 8. And then verse 9, this is the stone Tanakh, so it might be different verse numbering. "Like everything that I show you, the form of the tabernacle and the form of all its vessels, so shall you do." So the interesting thing about this is that if you are simply reading the English, you're getting a translational value, and it's like, okay, like everything I show you, the form of the tabernacle, the form of the vessels, so shall you do. It's like, and then you move on, because that's all you're doing is reading the words of a narrative of something that Moshe was told to do. But if you go back and you say, let's look at this a little closer. In fact, here, I'll go back to verse 8 and I'll write it in, if I write it in the Paleo, can you all follow, or should I write it in both, or?
If you write it in the Hebrew,
Yeah.
You know modern Hebrew well enough to follow? Okay,
No.
I'll do both, and there's a reason for that. But anyway, so I'll start with verse 8. Ve'asho mikdash ve'shekanti betokam Okay, that's verse 8, and what that would be in the modern is So you understand that? You okay? And then the next verse. I'll just take that many words here. So do you all read Hebrew enough to?
No,
Not at this point.
You
No.
don't? Okay, so, not to be confusing then, but for the sake of the record on camera, or so you know what I'm talking about, this whole study that I'm trying to do, which I'll try to explain to you, is all about the spelling of words. I'm not trying to impress upon you a particular doctrine or a certain set of beliefs. One thing I tried to get across yesterday was this notion that the Hebrew language is not just some arbitrary human composition whereby people put together sounds and phonetics to come up with a language. Nor is it one of the alternatives that morphed after the Tower of Babel incident. But the premise that I have is that this particular language was constructed by Elohim, Kana Shemayim Ve'eretz, maker of the heavens and the earth, that he constructed this assemblage of glyphs, these 22 little letter shapes, that he put them together of his own choosing, by his own design, on purpose, for a very particular reason. And we have lost the reason, and all we have left is, it's an alphabet, a bunch of letters. Here, let me... Do you all know, if I spoke the words, would that help? Would you recognize the Hebrew words? Okay, so just so you know what's going on here, this particular letter, have you ever heard the phrase "osei fele"? You know what that means? Osei fele. But you've heard the words
Yeah,
before.
we sing it all the time.
You sing those words all the time. They come from a very particular verse. I have it written down somewhere and I could look it up, but I'll tell you what it means. It means, hasn't he done wonderful things? Okay, so the word osei comes from this word here, but this is asho, right? So if the sheen has, in modern Hebrew, if the dot's on the right-hand side, that's a sh sound. And if it's on the left-hand side, that's an S. So I'm going to guess, though I'm not looking at it, that if it's osei, it's because it's pronounced so it's left, okay? So if you, in Hebrew, is it okay if I go back over some root stuff of Hebrew? Is that, okay. So in Hebrew, the Semitic language group, which is where you get French and Spanish and English and Latin languages and all that, three-letter verb roots. Now, if it's a verb root, that doesn't mean that the noun is necessarily exactly like that, but it's a three-letter construction base. So if I say, well, vav here is a prefix that means and, it's a conjunction prefix, so it also can mean or, but, when, then, therefore, even though there's other words that can be used to mean therefore, like kaf yod. In other words, that could be meaning, however, vav is a kind of a generic conjunction. In the dictionary, there's very few words that start with a vav. There's only like 3 or 4 pages of words that start with vav, and something like mem might have 40 pages or whatever it might be. So sometimes you can take that letter vav as almost like a throwaway letter when you're trying to spell words. When it ends up in the back end as a suffix, quite often it's translated as they, but you can also read it as either he or it. So you can say, well, when I was in grade school, we had to learn grammar, English language syntax, and it's like, it's the nuts and bolts of how English works, and it was this dry, dreary, but you know, how do you, what do they call it when you break down a sentence to predicate and subject to conjugate verbs, or what was the other word for
Diagram?
Diagram sentences, there you go.
Diagram
Yes.
sentences.
English will never work because it's a conglomerate of everything else and none of the rules fit. I was an English teacher.
None of the rules fit?
No, they don't. They come from all the other languages. Until in the 70s, they came up with something called transformational grammar, which handled it better because it admitted it fit the English language and didn't keep using old rules.
The way I remember being taught by some other English teacher was, you better learn these rules or you get these big red notes on your page.
Exactly.
Interesting now, for whatever the reason is, that's a whole other matter, why I write the paleo in red. But, you know, usually, it used to be that when the teacher had red ink on your page, you did everything wrong. And I'm trying to say, hey, I write it in red to be distinctive so that when I study, the paleo letters are in red, and I use other colors of pens to write on the page and everything else in reference. It's kind of like, you know, in the New Testament KJV, red letter words of Messiah. But anyway, that's just an arbitrary thing. But anyway, you know, you can kind of humorously look at saying, gosh, you know, great efforts were went to let us learn the proper way to do things, and then all of a sudden you hear on the inside track, it's like, by the way, we know that there's no rules, and we know that nothing works. And it's like, well, gee, thanks for telling us now. But just to say, when you get into the business of translation, it's going to work the same way. So what I'm going to show you today about the Mishkan pattern, I personally, literally don't know anybody else that's ever said these words, except maybe other people that listen to me and say, hey, yeah, you know, but what I'm saying is I don't know other scholars or teachers that have come up with this. So somebody asked the question, it's like, okay, where do you get your validation? You know, which college did you go to that taught you this stuff that you learned and got some good marks on your paper so that now we can listen to? It's like, I don't know. So I don't know who you can go to validate this. Just saying that there's a fellow by the name of Frank Seekins in Scottsdale, Arizona. He did a book called Hebrew Word Pictures. It's about 20 years ago or so. Now he's got a few updated versions. It was almost written like for grammar school level. Now it's written for almost like college level. I mean, he's really elaborated. But he doesn't talk about what I'm going to talk about, this Mishkan pattern. Jeff Benner, down in, I think it's Tennessee or Georgia or Mississippi or something, ancienthebrew.org is his site, and he's got all kinds of great stuff telling you all about how the Hebrew language works, which I'm not going to talk about that stuff because I'm not going to talk to you about diagramming sentences or proper Hebrew grammar. But he does a good job of that type of thing, but he, that I know of, doesn't talk about this Mishkan pattern thing. So, for me to say, there's also this friend, Joan, up in Alberta, that was telling me, okay, let me tell you how to conjugate the verbs, and there's certain letters that you put, and this is third person future, this is first person past, it's like, it's all kind of a blur. And it's not proper of me to not regard grammar in its specific way that it's done. And you being an English teacher would appreciate saying, you better learn that stuff. And so my friend Joan was trying to encourage me, and it's like, I'm sorry, for some reason it just doesn't quite stick in my mind. So, when I get to something like this and say, look, there's a vav at the end of this word. If you look at the verb root of ayin sheen, it would be in the dictionary, if you look at, I'll write in paleo, if you look at ayin sheen hey, this is the English equivalent of the letter O, and this would be pronounced as S or say SH, and this is the H. So it would be, it's not really a silent letter, but this is almost like hey, so it's osei, right? So that's where they come up with osei. And it literally means to make, to do, to produce, to force, to compel, to have this causative action of...
Sorry to disturb you.
No disturbance. Shabbat shalom. Nobody can disturb you. Even if you fall asleep, it's Shabbat, go ahead. So this word has to do with this induced to act, kind of pushing. It's very, very similar to another word that's modern Hebrew, pei, ayin, lamed. Is anybody familiar with that word? Pei, ayin, lamed? In
Work,
P,
to work.
to work, it's also to be induced or
It's verb, also.
caused
it's a
to
verb.
act, right? So I could show you the dictionary if anybody's interested, and you can look it up. But the interesting thing is these two words are almost synonyms. Now, in the Christian church world, you read about Saul, who had his name changed to the Roman version, which was Paul, right? Do you know why?
Well, of course, because he started the church, and when he did, Jesus gave him that name, right?
Paul?
No, he had, no, he always had that
Something like
name.
that, yes.
He has both names.
Why
The
did
Holy Spirit still calls him Saul,
Okay, so
after the road to Damascus thing.
after I started
He didn't
going
change
to
his
some
name.
Messianic congregations, they always call him Rav Shaul. They never call him Paul in the Messianic circles. Why?
The Holy Spirit still called him
He's
Shaul
a Jewish rabbi.
When did he ever call him Shaul?
in Acts.
It says Shaul. I only
Yes,
ever remember
yes.
reading Paul.
Well, it depends on your
Oh.
translation.
A different translation.
You can look it up. He didn't change his name. He had two names like a lot of Jews you know today.
Oh, yes.
They have a
They
Hebrew
have a
name.
family name, they have a real name,
Yeah.
they don't always say their name.
What were you saying?
You had a Greek name for the diaspora.
Right.
Was Paul his Greek name for the
Yes.
diaspora?
Paulos.
Where did he get that? Well, there's Apollos, but that was another guy.
Paulos.
Paulos.
In Greek, it would be Paulos.
Yeah.
Okay, the point I'm
In
making
English,
is this.
Paul.
So here, like I said, it's all about words. It's all, this whole thing is about words. In the beginning was the Word. We talked about that the other day. So why did he choose Paul? Well, that was the Roman name. That was the Greek name. It came from Paul. Wait a second. Is it Greek? Is it Roman? The word spelled pei ayin lamed means one who is compelled or induced to act. Who is this guy? Well, he's the guy who hated what became known as the Christians and persecuted them and tortured them and was out to get them. And all of a sudden, something happened which, wham, changed his direction completely. And because of this overwhelming event, he was compelled to become the epitome of what he used to persecute.
Right.
Well, that's the meaning of the word Paul. Paul.
Awesome.
That's still Hebrew.
Wow.
So is it his Roman name, a Greek name? No, it's more Hebrew. He never jumped ship. He's still Hebrew.
That's interesting.
I'm just saying, once you start messing with words, you can all of a sudden see different insights.
So that's what they would have called him in the first century, is Paul.
Pei ayin lamed, I don't know what they call him, but what I'm saying is I bumped into this because I'm just looking at words in the dictionary, and all of a sudden I see this word and I'm trying to pronounce, how would you pronounce that?
So
Pei-
possibly more of a title or a descriptor as opposed to a name?
Sure,
And being
You know, that
transferred
guy-
as a name?
sure, exactly. So as a matter of fact, interesting thing, if you go back and you look at, let's look at Cain and Abel, but before I do that, you raise your hand. What do
Can I
you?
just say, Stephen Pidgeon brings that up, that was his name because of being a worker.
Being a worker? Oh,
Well,
okay,
yeah,
right, it could be read as worker. It all depends on how you choose to translate the
But
word.
I don't remember how he described it, but I listened to Stephen Pidgeon and he brought that up too.
Okay, well, see, I don't know, I haven't heard that before, but I'm just saying that this word might mean worker, but one who is induced to act as a
Yeah.
worker. In other words, you say,
Is
will
that
you
Greek?
call the drywall guy to get over here and finish that up there?
Okay, not
You know,
like-
so you're bringing
But he
this
was a
guy
Roman
in to
citizen.
make something
Yeah,
happen.
it's a-
Yes.
But that's exactly what happened
But he
on
was
the
a
road
Roman
to
citizen, so
Damascus.
he had a Roman name.
So what I'm saying is that things get blended, as she was just saying, the English language is
Like a
this
friend.
amalgamation, this
Friend of mine.
conglomerate of all these different things, and we've inherited stuff and we think or make assumptions, oh, it's this or that. It's like, I don't know. I'm assuming that's why he took on the name of Paul. But for example, let's look at Cain and Abel. Now, if you read the story from the beginning of Bereshit, it's like, okay, Adam and Eve, the parents, they had two children and they named them Cain and Abel, right? That's the way the story goes. But if you look in the dictionary, the word Cain means, you could read it as one who rises up and strikes. Where do they come up with that? Cain is spelled Kuf Yod Nun, I believe is if I'm going off of memory here, Cain, right? Kuf is to rise up, is where you get the word kumi, or comb, to rise up. Yod is this working hand that grabs a hold of something, and Nun is this action, like this lightning bolt, and bam! So you could say the one who just rose up and wham, smacked his brother and killed him. Now why would you name your son that? The next one, Chavel, means transitory and lacking substance. You're going to name your child, well, he just is here and then gone, and he really amounts to nothing. What? Listen, there's no other children on the face of the earth. You could name these two children anything. Why would you name this one, rises up and strikes, and this one, he doesn't amount to much and he doesn't last very long? Those kind of are words that have become names that describes exactly what happened to those two guys. So did they name them that, or is those names what we have inherited through the ages of who those kids were? But see, that's not an English way of thinking. So we say, oh no, that had to be their names, because that's what it says. And it's like, it doesn't say they named them that, does it? So again, what I'm saying is we have to go back and look and say, we have these stories and they're written, but what do the writings actually say versus how are they translated and how are they interpreted? And I'm going to show you some different ways to get even, depending on how much time we have, even beyond what you think is written to what it might really be saying, which is that whole nother level. And the question is, well, who can validate this? And I'm suggesting that the language will validate itself, but it all depends on how far you want to take it, how deep into the words you want to go. I'm just using Cain and Abel as the example, and Paul and Shaul. But here, this word oseh then, or asha, or aso, I'm not necessarily going to articulate it properly because there's no vowel points above the sheen. And the big deal about this is something about working or making. Okay, so if we simply say, well, make, and if this is the Bob, you can say make it, make it. So here you have the word mikdash, and this is the word kadosh, or kadesh, or kiddush. It's basically the word that the Melachim, the angels, are saying. The ones that are going around the throne, they're not saying holy, holy, holy. The nice thing about holy, holy, holy is that it's poetically resonant and beautiful, and it makes for a good song. Holy, holy, holy.
In English.
Kadosh. Kadosh. But other people can turn kadosh into a nice, huh?
We sing it every week.
Kadosh, kadosh, kadosh.
Kadosh, kadosh, Adonai Tzevot.
And how does it sound to you? Kadosh, kadosh.
Beautiful.
It sounds beautiful, but is that to a trained ear? When you first heard the word kadosh or kadesh,
I probably wouldn't have thought it a long time ago.
see, that's the thing. So what I'm saying is that as you develop an appreciation and a taste auditorily for the sound of Yahuwah's own personal words, they become more palatable, they become tasty, they actually become beautiful, is what I've found. And the other loses its appeal. That's what I found. So I try to use his words, and even if, just so you know, there's at least Ashkenazi and Sephardic, there's those two camps, and then there's other groups that articulate things a little differently. And then I've heard it said, you know, nobody really knows how these very words were spoken by David, or even did David know how Moshe might have said them. And then you go back to before the flood, and it's like, so who's to authorize and validate exactly the correct articulation? There's a lot of culture and time that goes into this. So what I'm trying to say is, I'm not going to say somebody's right or wrong, and neither can anybody else really say what's right or wrong. All they can say is, we don't do it that way. Right, okay. You guys don't do it that way. Fine, but what did he say and what does he mean? That's what this is about. Okay, so I may not articulate things quite the way that they would be, but the question is, what is he telling us here? So this word kadosh, or kedesh, is and I'll always write this with a Q for Q, and then the cough is a K, and the het, there's not one on here, but het, just so you know, the sound is if you drag a shovel behind you on the asphalt. That's the sound of the het. So it's, when people write CH, I hear people call it Chonica
I know.
and Chaim for, it's like,
What? I was never really looking at me.
We had a politician that did that.
But I have a lisp too, so who cares?
so here we go, Hashem Echad. It's like, you know,
True story, Methodist minister's kid, I couldn't say Methodist because I had a horrible lisp, so I would say Lutheran parsons, what people would call. It didn't work.
It wasn't true.
so it's all the same. It's like they're all just, anyway, there was a dictionary, this for the letter het, there was a dictionary that had an H with a dot under it, and one of them, I think, had an H with a X under it, and a lot of people draw it with a C, so I'll always write it with a C with a little X, because if you're typing, you're not going to get it underneath. But if I write CX, it sounds like, yeah. And I was looking into a dictionary for the word sepul. I think I was looking at sepulveda or whatever it was in English. And the word sepulcher, well, that's real close to there's a place in LA called Sepulveda. And it said that it was a low gravelly sound, but it was also a tomb or a crypt. Sepulcher, a low gravelly sound. Now, why do you think, here just using a little bit of detective work, why do you think that the word that means a crypt, a tomb, would also mean a low gravelly sound? Where do you think that would come from?
Hebrew.
Why would it come from Hebrew? From the het. But why would a crypt or a tomb sound like the letter het?
Or the coffee machine.
What's that? I didn't hear you.
That's all right. Oh, it's not like the coffee machine too.
Well, if you look at the paleo,
Yeah.
Look at the
By the way, this is
paleo.
the answer to everything.
It is the answer to everything. The reason is because in the alphabetic letter sequence, which we'll get to right after this verse, is that that letter represents a tomb. It's a fence, it's an enclosure, it's a sheepfold, and the reason it sounds like a low gravelly voice is you pronounce it as het. And even that in English dictionary doesn't know where it came from, but I'd be willing to bet $1 million if I had it that that's where it came from. And I'd be willing to argue the case with anybody. And I'll show you why. And the reason why is because the Romans killed Yeshua on the cross and then dumped him in a tomb, and that's what that letter says. That's where that comes from.
That's right. Forgot about that already.
Okay, so anyway, the point is, kadosh, mikdash, so the mem prefix means the place. It can mean of, but it can also mean away from. So quite often in Hebrew is that one word or concept will also at the same time simultaneously mean the opposite. So for example, Pesach can also, it means to jump over, so it's also kind of like the threshold, but Psalmic pay is actually threshold, but it also means to be lame. So if you're lame, you can't take a lame animal and sacrifice it or eat it on Pesach, so it's like, so it's this thing which is a concept, and then everything around the concept is also part of that concept, or part of that word, or part of that letter. So in English, if you wrote a sentence, back in my English class, and it says, for example, you know, Jim and Bob went to the store and he bought a drink. And it's like, who? I remember the teacher writing who, and you can't just say he, but I'll tell you, the scripture does this all the time.
Everywhere.
Absolutely.
For example, there's a really famous verse. Abraham went and fought these 5 kings and wiped them out and came back with a bunch of loot. Melchizedek shows up and offers him this greeting of bread and wine, and he gave him a tenth of everything. And then, right after that happens, the king of Sodom says, hey, why don't you take all my stuff too? And Abraham says, I'm not even going to take even a shoelace, lest anybody says, you made Abraham rich. And it's like, now why would the king of Sodom say that? The question is, He gave him a tenth of all. Who gave who a tenth of what? It's translated, Abraham gave a tenth of everything he just pillaged from these kings and gave it to Melchizedek. But it doesn't say that. It says he gave him a tenth of all, and then the king of Sodom is going to give Abraham a bunch of the loot. Well, why should he do that? Did he maybe just see Melchizedek give to Abraham a tenth? Well, wait a minute. The book of Hebrews says Abraham gave a tenth to Melchizedek. Where did the book of Hebrews get it? Doesn't say so in Genesis. Yasher, the book of Yashar, says that, very specifically, it says Melchizedek gave Abraham a tenth of all. But why would he do that? Or Abraham gave Melchizedek a tenth. So Abraham just goes out there and he fights this big giant battle. In the book of Yashar, it also says, I think it says there was like 800,000 guys. It was either 80,000 or 800,000. Abraham had 300. And he goes there and he wipes them all out. And the only ones that escaped were some youths who jumped on the camels and took off. 5 kings with at least 80,000 soldiers, and Abraham with 300 of his friends destroyed them all. And then he's going to come back from this battle and, oh, here's Melchizedek. Hey, Melchizedek, why don't you take a tenth of everything we just got? But Melchizedek himself was the king of Salem. And Abraham, I would guess, would be wary and coming back and say, what's the staging of just happened here? If you read the words, you don't know, because it says he gave him a tenth of all. But because of that event, it sets up not only Psalms 110, verse 4, the order of Melchizedek, but it also sets up Hebrews chapters 7 and 8, which is this whole other thing going on these days, and they were talking about it over there at Fringe today. But the question is, gosh, what does this mean? What does this matter? Well, it said because then it's like, okay, where do we go with this? Well, just so you know, I'm not going to run down that line. I'm just trying to show you that one little controversial thing, like who gave who what, if it's qualified by a non-scriptural book like Yashar, and then it's picked up in the book of Hebrews, well then it must be true. And we were talking about this on the way over here. Who wrote the book of Hebrews?
We don't know.
Paul, Apollos, somebody.
Well, who wrote the book of Genesis? Moshe, under the authority of speaking face to face with Yodivah. Okay, so we know, and I'm not trying to pick at the people at French, mind you, but he was talking about this verse. And he says this is a nuclear bomb going off, and he was quoting from Hebrews 7, and he said, you know, the Aaronic priesthood, because the priesthood has changed, the law changes. And he was talking about that, and I guess he got himself in trouble by some other group, as I hear the story, that somebody says, you're a heretic for bringing up this Torah-centric business. And it's like, okay, I'm not trying to qualify who's right or wrong, but I'm saying that this subject of who do you believe can be extremely volatile. And if we say, well, it says so in the book of Hebrews. Oh, okay, now we can trust it. Who wrote the book of Hebrews? Well, it was probably Paul. And if Hebrews apparently contradicts something written in the book of Genesis, well, now which one do you believe? Well, if Moshe got it directly, face to face from Elohim on Mount Sinai, do you guys know what the word Sinai means?
Yeah, it's a thorn bush.
Samik Yod Nun, it can mean thorn bush, and I think the word squirrel is related to that. Samik Yod Hey, see, the one that lives in the bush. But it also means erudite scholarship.
Oh, really?
And it's a reference of China. Maybe because those guys are very astute, very scholarly, but Samik Yod Nun Hey, I think, or Samik Yod Nun Aleph, Yod perhaps, is really erudite scholarship. So the interesting thing is, why in the world would Elohim choose the mountain's name to be erudite scholarship? I mean, extremely detailed scholarly thesis work. I think it's because he wants us to look into his words with that kind of scrutiny. And so therefore it validates, and yet I was told by somebody who claimed to be a prophet that to think is carnal. To think is carnal. Don't try to figure it out, you're being more critical.
Yeah.
Come, let us read it together.
But the Holy Spirit, I think, was validating that whole teaching. So what I'm saying is, what is this Holy Spirit? Who is this Jesus? Who wrote what book telling us what based on what information? And I could take the time to jump into Melchizedek if you want to at some point, but I'm just bringing up these contentious issues to say, how do we know we're right?
Exactly.
About what? How do we know? Well, it says so in Hebrews. Well, where did it get its validation? Jasher. Well, how do we know Jasher's right? Jasher's so questionable, they won't even put it in the compilation of the text of the 66 books. So what are we using that to prove what? So who gave who what for what reason? Now it's all speculation. So instead of being confident, we now have to agree that it's speculative. So what I'm saying is, how do we know we're right about anything? How do we know we're right about anything the book of Hebrews says if it contradicts the Torah, especially if it says, oh, we have to change the law because now we have a new priest? Really? Well, when we get a new president, he will change some stuff. Every administration changes some stuff. But is there any scripture that mandates that if the high priest dies, that you have to change the law? No. If Yahweh's Torah endures forever, and if that's the, do we call it law? What's the difference between chok and mitzvot and edot and Torah? I mean, there's half a dozen different words that he uses that are translated interchangeably to mean instructions, commandments, ordinances, statutes, mishpat, judgments, and they're all haphazardly shuffled back and forth, and it's like, whoa, wait a minute. I think that each one of them means something, and each one of them was used for a particular reason, and if we just take this English word law and stick it in there and say, oh, when you get a new high priest, it all has to change. Wait a minute, what are you saying? I'm not trying to argue with what's being preached, but I'm saying, if you really want to get down to it, and argue, let's base it on these words. And then we have to say, what do these words mean? It's like, well, hey, this means to work. It kind of means work, but it means more than, so what I'm saying is, if we want to find what is kadosh, mikdash, it's translated, oh, that's the holy place. Where's the holy place? Well, it's the land of Eretz Israel. It's the place, it's the land, it's the... Make a place that's kadosh, and here's this word sheken. Right? So this is the SH, and that's the K, and that's the M. And this is T, Tav Yod, which means my, this is the suffix, just basically means my, and this one basically means and, or therefore. And this tav, whether the tav is at the beginning or here like it's in the beginning, and there it's at the end, prefix or suffix, it seems like it just affects timing, so whether it's present tense or past or future. And I've seen the exact same word translated in the Stone's Tanakh as being past tense, and in maybe KJV it's future, or vice versa, as if they don't know. I tried to figure it out. Well, if the tav is beginning, does that mean it's future, or if it's the end, is it past, or vice versa? They shuffle it around. Now maybe grammatically somebody says, oh, we've determined certain rules, that this is the way it worked. But really, the rules are all weird. And I think that even the modern scholars have to go back and try to figure out, what were those guys doing? What did they mean by writing it this way or that way? And there's no consensus among the professionals. So what I'm saying by that is, I think that it's fair game for us to look at these words and have at it. And to say, yeah, but what is the way you're supposed to do it? And it's like, the professionals don't even agree. So for us to try to figure out what he said is a fair effort, but based on what credibility, what qualifications? Well, that's the next verse. I'll show you that in a minute. Betokam, and this word bet is daughter, and this kaf mem is basically you all as a suffix. Well, if this is daughter, how do you get make a place and I will dwell with you there? Isn't that the way it's expressed? Do you remember? It's because this word tafav, what's that?
Oh, I was just repeating that.
This word tafav ends up being the root word, which I believe, I can get my dictionary out, basically means to be right stuck in the middle, which has to do with also the word for stitching. Does anybody know Hebrew enough to validate that?
No. Really?
Oh, no.
Well, you guys always putting it all the time and you don't know?
What?
I'm just making fun of the guys who do it all the time.
Oh.
Making with the big guy.
They're up here every day.
Work of an embroiderer.
And then you don't know. You don't know.
Tav kaf is stitch or seam.
What is it?
Stitch or seam,
Yeah,
like
the word.
tav kaf. But see, if you stick a vav or a yod in the middle of it, so tav yod kaf means middle, tav yod kaf vav nun tikkun, and tav vav kaf
I can't see it.
means internal or inside. Tav vav kaf yod, toki. Tav vav kaf means to mediate or behave as a middleman, to interpose. It's also deceit. So now why would deceit be the same thing? If somebody takes a message and shanghais it and changes it and sends it on, that's kind of like what's happening with the translations.
Oh, yeah.
So here,
So
you could say,
are you combining bach and the vav there and the kaf? When you're
I'm saying this word tok,
the
means-
tok is in the center or in the middle of something.
right, internal and in the center, but it also means to deceive.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that if you try to analyze the spelling of these words, bet tav, bat, is where you get the word for daughter, but it also means one deserving of, and it's like the village that's under the auspices of the jurisdiction of a bigger city nearby. A city or a village is the same. It also means one deserving of. So you could say, this is you all, but what I'm saying is if you try to start breaking down Hebrew words, you bump into these other issues.
Right.
But I could take a step back and say, make a place that's kadosh, translated as sanctuary, or as a sacred ground, a separate place. And this word sheken is where you get the word, it's translated in Greek as taverno. And if you change the B of the V to a B, that's where you get the word tabern, as in tabernacle. But taverno is where we get the word tavern. You know, like the bar down the street, the pub.
Place.
The tavern. It's
Hole.
the meeting place where you should cool and drink beer and, you know, it's like, God, well, that's where,
That's where all the shepherds went.
if you stick a mem in front of it, that's where you get the word meshkan, which is the place of, and then if you look at, this is shack, shin kaf, which is just this little hangout place.
Right.
So the little hangout place in kaf noon, that's where you get the word can, which means yes. So truly thus. And the Kohen is the kaf hey noon, right? And his job is to point to that which is true and teach us. So it all has to do with validating, it's like really, this is the place where we can just hang out together. But this is sacred and this is casual. But he's saying, hey, I want to be right in the middle of where you guys hang out. I want to be right in there. So, as was said in the book of Hebrews, that somebody was talking about the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the temple, well, that's bad. That's of the ilk of Hagar, which is of the law and slavery. But now we have Christ in us, and that's good. That's a better covenant. The other one was just no good and poor and fading, and how could they even deal with it for so long? But now we have this better thing. It's like that's what the book of Hebrews says, and it's like, really? Can somebody please tell me, just in this one forward verse, where the frailty and the pathetic bad covenant was that had to be done away with because it was of Hagar's slavery? That's what's being taught. Make, and I'm going to tell you how, make a place that's kadosh. There's nothing bad with kadosh. Kadosh is kadosh. It's unaffected, it's untainted, it's so pure and clean that even the angels, the Melachim around the throne, say the word kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. And if it feels and sounds grating to our ears, it shows you how far away from the kadosh we are. Because what they say, they could think of no greater word to express the majesty, the set-apartness, the beyond comprehension, the beyond words. And if the only word they can use to describe what they are experiencing is kadosh, then for him to say, this place where I will be in your midst is going to be a kadosh place, that's got to be full and beautiful and pure and saturated. And how can then whoever wrote Hebrews say that stuff is no good and it must be changed to give us the better thing? And that's what's being said. And if you just take that at face value, something is very wrong. Now we have to identify what's wrong. But when that's what's being said, now it sets up a controversy. Which is why, as he said, this is like a nuclear bomb going off, and it's like, where's the nuclear bomb? If he didn't articulate it, I'm trying to articulate it and saying the bomb is the people that believe these words are valid and true, endure forever, expressing the heart of the one who's kadosh. And he says, I'm going to have a kadosh place to be stuck right in the middle of your internal parts. Then whoever wrote Hebrews and says, that's no good, and now we're going to have, Christ in us, this word means internal. Where's the distinction? It's whatever Yahusha came and did and said was, I only do what I see the Father doing. I only say what I hear the Father saying. It can't be different. So to say, oh, well, if he's going to be a different type of priest, there has to be a different covenant. There has to be a different law. And it's like, what part of perfect has to be different? Something is wrong. And I'm suggesting that the way to find what's wrong is to go back to these pure words and pure letters where the heart of the Father has been expressed. And any variance from these words is what's wrong. And who wrote Hebrews? And how was he authorized to say what? I don't know. Even if it was Paul, even if it was Paul, who is Paul that I should regard him compared to the mouth of the Father written down from Moshe that Yeshua validated? Gee, if you can't hear Moshe, you can't hear me. What's that got to do with Paul? But I'm just saying, I'm trying to describe the problem of why, even within the Messianic realm or the Hebrew roots realm or the Christian versus Jew, this is the very problem. So for Daniel to say, hey, this is a nuclear bomb, and we were coming over here, it was like, well, he didn't really say what the bomb was. And it's like, this is what he's talking about. This is the stuff. Why? Because some people say, I don't need no stinking law. It was done away with. It was, Yeshua spilled his blood to get us free from that law. And it's like, from the law that Yeshua said, I only do what I see my Father doing and hear and speak what I hear him saying, that law? This law that's the kadosh place where he's going to shechen with us right in our midst, that law? So if I find this to be detestable, it goes back to Vayikra 26 where Yahuwah says, if you consider my words to be loathsome and detestable, and you treat them with a casual indifference, then reciprocally, a mirror image of your same attitude, I will treat you with a fury of casualness, and I will not listen when you scream because you didn't listen when I speak. And if somebody's going to then use, that book of Hebrews calls it the law of Hagar, under the bondage of servitude, if you're going to use that as an excuse to not listen, then you're setting yourself up for the retaliatory backlash of your own doing, which is more of Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, which is the curse which has prevailed for nearly 3,000 years. And is that teaching going to perpetuate the condition instead of resolving the situation? And when I see Yahweh saying, listen, Shema. If you listen to me, I listen to you. If you do not listen to me, I can't listen to you, because it's a reciprocal balancing. This is this mishpat, which is the foundation of the throne. It's not like, He's pulling it out. No, this is the way it works. It's a mirror. When you turn away from my words, I can't hear you. Because he's provided these words as the dynamic basis of the interaction of communication. And so if we have preachers and priests and rabbis and whoever teaching for hundreds and thousands of years of telling us every excuse to not listen, that's our own foolishness perpetuating the problem. For us to listen means we have to have a means by which to listen and find the problem and resolve it. So if I just give you translations of English without telling you how to determine it, why should you believe me? That's what this Mishkan pattern is all about. So here he says, I'm going to dwell in your midst. And the word dwell, this shekin, has to do, the letter shin can be a prefix letter, which means that which has to do with, that which belongs to. Khan is true. Validate, verify. This will be the mechanism of validating me being right here with you. It's in the language. Kakal, like all, or in the, as everything, asher, that which, ani, I. There's a few different words for I. One is ehye, as in ehye, asher, ehye, I am that I am. One is anoki, which is the first word in Exodus 20 of the Ten Commandments. Anoki, Yodhe Vav He, El Heka, your Elohim. I am that guy. But this is another word, ani, which is kind of like the emperor surrounded by his armies, the admiral surrounded by his fleet. I in my majesty. It's fleets, it's ships, it's, if you look in the dictionary, there's some majestic being of his presence. If you look at this word, mem resh aleph he, ma, whoop, I wrote the wrong letter down. That's it. It should be a modern resh. This word, resh aleph he, means to make visible. It's translated simply see. Whatever you see, whatever I show you. This word here, you know the word atah, aleph tav he? You know how that's pronounced? Or what that means?
You.
You. Well, then why is this spelled aleph vav tav kaf? It's also translated you. If atah is you, resh aleph he is look or see or to put on exhibition or to make comprehensible, to make perceptible. In other words, there's a verse, Deuteronomy 28, either 29, 28, I think it is, where he says, those things, whatever is not made evident, whatever is not visible, whatever is not seen, it's unto Elohim. That's whatever he doesn't show us, that's his business. But whatever he makes visible, lenu velabenu, for us and our children, in order to keep the words of this Torah until somebody comes along and changes them. No, they can't be changed. What he made visible is for us and our children. It's our responsibility to teach our children to keep the words of this Torah. Okay, there's something about that. No, there's dots above those words. So I am feeling comfortable about changing my life instead of being a Christian who says those things are done away with, those people are going to burn in hell, they all rejected the Messiah, they don't know nothing, they're under blindness. No, they're keeping the words of the Torah. There's something validating about that I need to become in line with, not throw them all away and say they don't know nothing. It's like, he said, keep the words of this Torah forever, us and our children. That's what he put on evidence, what he put on exhibition to make evident to us. I'm blending some things together here. It may sound a bit reactionary, but I'm using the occasion of a certain sermon to trigger something bigger that's happening in our world, in our culture today, in America, happening on the internet, that has to do with this very same subject. Just so you know. So, Resh, Aleph, Hey. Resh is head, Aleph is first order strong. So you could say that this is the greatest stuff put on exhibition. If you go to a museum, you'll find the best stuff that we've been able to dig up or steal from other people and say, hey, we'll go do that. That's basically what this is. Aleph, Vav, Tav, Kaf. Aleph, Vav, Tav. Aleph, Vav, Tav in the dictionary, it's pronounced oath, and it means oath. It means terms of an agreement. It's a sign or a symbol or some sort of indicator. So if you have a wedding ring, that might be the sign of your marriage vows.
The Sabbath.
A Sabbath is a sign that we are in covenant with the Creator of the heavens and the earth. If you have a mezuzah on your mezuzah means doorpost, right? So mezuzah is actually, if you have writings, if you have devarim, certain words on your mezuzah, does it have to be certain words? It could be something else that says, hey, I am his. If you put something on the doorposts of your house and upon your gates, and if you have them on your mind, like for example, the letters on this hat, these letters are the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet. So is this some sort of like a phylactery sort of a thing? Kind of sort of is. It's having his words on our mind. Does it have to take a certain shape or form? It's some sort of a symbolic oath. The Kaf at the end means you. So what does it say? As or like everything that I show you. Why didn't he just use a Tav? What's Aleph Vav Tav? It's a sign or symbol, but if you look in the dictionary, it's not in Strong's Concordance, it says Aleph Vav Tav also means a letter of the alphabet. Something, if this is a letter of the alphabet that he's given you, that's yours. Aleph Tav, nobody knows what Aleph Tav means. Bill Sanford wrote a book, the Masoretic or the Messianic Aleph Tav Scriptures, and he suggests, well, whenever there's an Aleph Tav, that points to Yeshua. Yeshua in the book of Revelation says, I'm the beginning and the end, the first and the last, Alpha and Omega, which would be Aleph and Tav. But does that mean this is pointing to Yeshua? If Yeshua is the Word made flesh, well then is this referring to the Word? What Word? There's bigger questions that we can deal with, but the point is, well, this is just a grammatical device pointing to the action of the verb onto the particular noun. So is he showing you him what? This is the word which it is T-B-N-I-T, or tabinit, and it's the word that's pattern. Ha-mishkan, and here's this word mishkan again, which is the same here. Shekin is the action, mishkan is the place of, and Aleph Tav, that goes on to the articles that we're not going to talk about. So here what I said, the mishkan pattern, that's this phrase here, the mishkan pattern. But see, here's an interesting thing in the word pattern, is that there's two X shapes in the Paleo, which is, if you have a contract, sign here,
That's the sign,
X.
okay.
If you agree, you put your mark. And if you're illiterate, you can't read or write, you can just put an X, and that's your mark. Or just look at somebody's signature, a squiggle. It's just put a mark that indicates that you're in agreement. Okay, if that's X, then here's two signatories of covenant. And B'nai, Bet Nun Yod, is mediating, like this word betok, is mediating in between something. So here, tok can mean deceit. But Yeshua, who claimed to be the B'nai Elohim, Israel, who's supposed to be B'nai Elohim, this is B'nai mediating in between the signatories of the contract of the covenant. So there's something about the job obligation of being the son. The word ben is very similar to bat, meaning it's one who's deserving of. So if you want to be B'nai Israel, you have to be deserving of mediating the terms of the covenant between Elohim and the rest of the world accurately. If you misrepresent